Hello, everyone, and welcome to Module 2, as well as a preview for Module 2.1, in which you'll be reading selections from Environmentalism of Popular Culture. So Module 2 is about sustainability, but linked to sustainability is this idea of social justice. And what is social justice? Perhaps you know, and if not, we'll talk about that as I talk about just what this whole module, the next 5 sub-modules that you have, will do. And this will all end with you reading a piece of literature, a novel, from the vantage point of sustainability, which is going to be a little bit different and include some different ways of reading than we saw in Module 1 for the first half of the course. So let's just talk about some things that we can expect in the module. Sustainability is an attention to resources. This is probably what you think about right away. We tend to think about food and water and overpopulation and climate change and basically the disappearance of human beings or some very, very drastic reductions, in our population because there's not enough food or water or whatever resources around for everyone, right? That would include war, I suppose, as there's a battle over resources. And some people would say that's already going on. When you look at how militaries are used to protect resources, such as energy resources, right, oil and whatnot. But I think this is what most people think of when they think of sustainability, as they think of where are my food and water coming from? How hot is it outside? Do I have adequate shelter? How many people live in my town? Are systems strained in some way? And that's a great way to think about it. So recognize right away then, this is point number 2, sustainability is anthropocentric. That just means it's human-centered. It's about human survival. In that way, we can say right away that sustainability is distanced from some forms of environmentalism that argued that nature is more important or as important as humans. And so you can see there's going to be a difference in environmentalists and environmentalisms. If you thought they were all the same, they are definitely not. Even though hopefully after Module 1, you can see that there are many different types of statements on nature, definitions of nature, and they all lean toward, different views of the relationship between nature and humans and who's more important or what is more important and what we're supposed to do. So we're still in that territory, but don't see this as all the same. That's the point I want you to take away here. Some forms of environmentalism may claim to be nature-based, but in the end, if the participants were forced with, looking at their own survival, suddenly we might say they might change their tune, so to speak. So we have these viewpoints of how we define nature, but from a practical aspect, I'm sure most people are human-centered and concerned with their own survival first. But just recognize that that is what sustainability is all about. And that is a bias, and that's not bad necessarily. So the first reading, Sturgeon, Module 2.1, that's this little nifty essay that you have here. We'll tackle some of these differences. It's going to tackle some of the accidental messages that come out of not anti-environmentalists, but environmentalists. And it's going to look at some of the cultural rhetorical problems that the environmental movement, or movements we could say, has birthed. So the interesting thing about this reading, we'll talk about it more, is that it's critiquing the environmental movement, even though Sturgeon's clearly an environmentalist as well. But he's looking at the shortcomings of the movement. And so this will feel familiar because of the world that you live in and from our first module and the things we've talked about there. I think we'll go with that. Point number 4, if we just want to talk about where we are in the course, the first module was a fairly traditional view or views of literature about the environment. You'd get this in most, literature in the environment course or, writing about nature or literature of nature or something like this. And so that was a fairly traditional look at the things that you would learn in any college course, no matter where you were going to college. So this unit on sustainability is going to extend and even critique some of those viewpoints. And one thing that I think is interesting is there's not a lot of academic work done on what it means to teach literature for sustainability. So I'm not going to say we're in uncharted territory here, but college professors like me are usually much better versed in talking about literature and its link to the environment, all that stuff that we had in Module 1. And there's less literature out there in some ways, or less ways of reading for what we're supposed to do with issues of climate change and sustainability and food shortages. As we'll see, a lot of that has been left to science fiction to imagine a world where there are some of these problems. And in fact, we'll probably close the course, regardless of when you take this course, with some science fiction and looking at some science fiction based upon sustainability. So that's kind of where we are. Again, we're not in uncharted territory, but there's not as many traditional ways of reading this We're still figuring out how to talk about climate change and to talk about fiction that deals with climate change. The readings and modules are the same if we're just looking at the order of things. Very similar to Module 1, you typically have an idea reading first by an academic that kind of loads you up with ideas. We had this in Merchant, right, and taught us about the fall and the recovery and stewardship and some of these basic ideas. And now we have this, this essay here from Sturgeon, Environmentalism and Popular Culture, looking at sort of environmentalism in the U.S. since the 1970s, but mainly since, say, the 1990s or so. So fairly current. And again, that's going to load us up with big ideas that we can then apply to literature for a while and for the duration of all the submodules. So one thing is that I want you to think about is, what is sustainability and what do you think of first? Probably those first things I mentioned, things that are linked to human survival, but water, food, overpopulation, climate change, maybe how consumerism is out of control and, you know, creating lots of garbage and waste in our world, maybe plastic in the oceans, you know, non-sustainable activities for our ecosystems, right? So that's linear rather than cyclical systems, or the good ones would be cyclical, of course. But here's what I hope you see. The inclusion of social justice, the leveling of social inequality, the rights and political standing of different classes, ethnicities, the different regions of the world, the underdeveloped and developing countries, and how unequal power now and over the centuries, the resources that they've either been given or not given in their land, their region, right? And all of the economic might, political might that they have. The U.S. has a lot, right? But African countries do not have much. Cultural differences and economic exploitation. Some of this historical, some of this still happening. They've all created a world where everybody, to achieve sustainability, to keep their communities alive, they all behave differently. They all make choices that can sometimes be damaging to the environment, but no other option is available to participate in the modern economy or to participate in some sort of sustenance food system. And so we can't distance sustainability from, let's just make it easy and say, the rich and poor of the world, the haves and the have-nots. The haves always have less environmental problems because the environmental problems tend to get dumped in the backyards, so to speak, of those with less political power and less money. And that can happen, you know, in the U.S., but it can also happen outside the U.S., where the entire U.S. might have it better because we send all of our trash, so to speak, and all of our environmental problems to other countries. Or if we don't send them there, we make sure that they are created there, and then we bring over the good stuff we want, and we leave the environmental problems behind, you know, India, Africa, China, wherever it may be, right? So this is what I want you to think about too. These inequalities in economics and social inequalities, people that have been marginalized across the world or even right here in the U.S., are a big part of this problem too. And as I just said, a lot of times these communities, they need jobs. They're trying to develop into a modern country with a modern infrastructure, and they will bear the brunt of environmental problems in order to move up in the world, or just in order to survive, to sustain their lives and community, right? And so that's what our first reading is about. That's what the Sturgeon reading is all about. You're going to get lots of examples of that, real simple examples, but you'll see them and the power of those examples is true and able to be played out in any community or any region across the world. So let's move on to an intro to Sturgeon's Environmentalism and Popular Culture. A really fun reading. You might look at it and say it's a bit long, but it's really fun. There's a lot of pictures at the end as well that will detail or illustrate these things for you. But let's take a look at some of the basic things you're going to see. So the reading details the relationship between environmental problems, sustainability, which we can see those as a bit different, even though they can overlap clearly, as well as the unequal social and economic histories and political histories or current political power. One thing I might point out is the reading is a bit jargony at times, but only when he's trying to come up with different labels for the different types of environmental movements or environmental activism that's going on around the world. You know, some people are interested in what he calls the global south. That would be the southern hemisphere and the problems they have. So he gives them their own name. You won't be asked to remember these names in the course, and you'll get the gist of what he's saying, even as the terminology kind of fades away from your memory. But just go for the big ideas here, the things that we can apply in the rest of the course, and the major parts of his argument that he's trying to teach you. So what is he going to talk about? Well, he's going to offer a lot of examples, as I said. He's going to give you some ways to analyze all the events in the world. One of the big things he's going to talk about I guess we'll talk about these first. He's going to give you the successes and problems of a number of environmental viewpoints. He'll even be critiquing some things that look an awful lot like some of the ideas from our module one. And we didn't critique them, we just maybe used them and applied them. He's now going to say, hey, there could be some shortcomings to this. And so this will be fun. We get to go back and review some of our early ideas and see how they could potentially be a problem, right? Or if they have some strength and success in some areas. He's going to offer you some new views linked to sustainability. So what does it mean to read something for sustainability, to analyze something to see if it's sustainable? And that would involve, again, not just resources like water, food, overpopulation, climate change, but also social equality. And so this is the major thing that's going to be new to you, and that I want you to pay attention to here as you read. He illustrates how defining some people as natural, and therefore implying that others are civilized, is not a thing of the past, but still creates problems in these people's lives. It creates problems for them, not just oppression, cultural stereotypes, but it means that we actually see them as lesser than other people and offload our environmental problems onto them. Okay, this is what happens when you see people as natural. Early on in the reading, he's going to give you a bunch of binaries, and he says that the environment is always opposite of civilization or humans. Or we could go civilization versus the wild versus the natural, something that sounds a lot like the pastoral, right? But what this does then is any other binary, it basically says that, men or white people or the people who have traditionally been in charge and have power, they're always assumed to be civilized, and it lets us link all other potentially oppressed people, women, minorities, the working class rather than the middle class or the professional classes, the poor versus the rich. They all get called more natural too. And because of that, they don't get the help they need and they receive the environmental problems. And he's going to make a pretty compelling argument that if basically you are unlinked, the less linked you are to sort of white privilege or to male dominance, especially economic dominance, CEOs, upper middle class type of things, you are going to be on the losing end of environmental problems because you don't have a lot of political representation, say for in the United States, Washington, D.C., the corporations or companies that create this potential environmental problem are also run mainly by white men, or at least men. And so their communities aren't going to suffer the environmental problems. They're going to send that business elsewhere. They're going to send those jobs elsewhere. And that's where the environmental damage or pollution will follow as well. So he sets up a really compelling argument that's really a pattern. And basically, if you are not connected somehow to the white male privilege that often operates in our world inside of political and economic systems, you're probably going to have more environmental damage. And the farther you are away from that center of power, you are going to be linked to the environmental damage, materially or physically. But then also, you're going to be represented just in popular culture as being somebody that's lesser than in some way. And so that's where we get to the end, the advertisements in the end. The other things that happen, of course, are then that these images are used sometimes to make us feel better about ourselves, better about nature. Certain people are seen as the caretakers, and you can read through my notes here. Some people are seen as the caretakers of the environment, and others are not, right? People that are termed more natural, like women or minorities, are seen as the people that should be out there caring for the environment in some way. When instead it probably should be CEOs and politicians in DC. They've got the most power. They've got to do the work, right? But when we don't see them as in charge of the environmental movement, as in charge of stewardship, and when environmentalists don't show them as being the people in charge, and instead environmentalists default to women or minorities or indigenous groups as being the people who are somehow more natural, then things don't change because the most powerful people aren't being asked to do anything. The least powerful people are being told that they're the ones that should be doing something. And so that's the big takeaway from this reading. That's basically what I'm saying in these notes, though. All right, so I hope you enjoy the reading. For your reading questions, I would just look at this list up here and go through it and look for the major ideas, but I would break it down according to the things I've said so far. What are the problems with environmental messages? What is the problem with calling people and things natural? Thank you.